Imagine diving to the bottom of the Mediterranean, expecting to find sea sponges, and instead discovering a 2,000-year-old computer that rewrites the history of technology. That is not science fiction. That is the real story of the Antikythera Mechanism, a device so advanced, it took modern scientists over a century just to begin understanding how it worked. Today, we are going to explore how it was found, what it actually did, who might have built it, and why this rusty box of gears has forced historians to admit the ancient Greeks were way more high-tech than we thought. Our story starts in spring 1900, off the tiny Greek island of Antikythera, between Crete and mainland Greece. A crew of sponge divers, led by Captain Demetrius Contus, took shelter from a violent storm and decided to dive the local waters while they waited it out. One diver went down and came back up pale, shaking, and terrified. He said he had seen a heap of dead naked people at the bottom of the sea. It turned out not to be bodies, but a massive ancient shipwreck littered with marble statues, bronze sculptures, and amphorae. This was a Roman cargo ship, dated to around 70 to 60 BCE, sitting about 45 meters deep, loaded with luxury goods traveling from the Greek world to Rome. The Greek government sent the Hellenic Royal Navy, and over the next year, divers pulled up an entire museum's worth of treasures, the first major underwater archaeological operation in history. And somewhere in all that chaos was our computer. All the artifacts were shipped to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. Among the statues and jewelry was a weird, corroded lump of bronze and wood, fused together like a rock. For 2 years, no one cared about it. Curators were busy reassembling glamorous marble statues, not this ugly green brick. Then, in 1902, archaeologist Vallejo Staris noticed something shocking. Inside the broken lump, he could see the teeth of a gear wheel. A gear in an artifact from around 100 BCE. At that time, historians believed complex gear systems were a medieval invention, not something ancient Greeks should be playing with. What they had stumbled upon was the Antikythera Mechanism, but it would take decades to understand just how insane this thing really was. The Antikythera Mechanism is now understood as the world's first known analog computer, a hand-powered machine that used gears to model the movements of the heavens. Originally, it was probably about the size of a thick laptop or a showbox, housed in a wooden case with dials on the front and back and rotating pointers. Inside that case, at least 30 bronze gears, some reconstructions suggest up to 37 or even more, cut with a level of miniaturization and precision similar to 14th century astronomical clocks, over 1,000 years later. By turning a hand crank, the user could track the sun and moon through the zodiac, show the phase of the moon with a small rotating sphere, follow long-term cycles like the 19-year Metonic cycle and the 223-month Saros cycle used to predict eclipses, and predict solar and lunar eclipses years in advance. More recent work suggests it may also have shown the positions of the 5 planets known to the ancients: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. In short, this was a mechanical cosmos in a box. Let's break down the genius. Without needing a PhD, turn the crank, and a main drive gear rotates, which then drives a network of smaller gears, some turning faster, some slower, some even moving backwards to mimic the strange motions of the heavens. The front likely showed a zodiac ring and a calendar ring, with pointers for the sun and moon. The moon's motion is tricky. Its speed changes because its orbit is elliptical, not perfectly circular. The mechanism uses a clever epicyclic gear train to model this variable speed. On the back, spiral dials track the Metonic cycle, where 19 years equal 235 lunar months, the Saros cycle, about 223 months, used to predict eclipses, and an even larger cycle called the exoligmos. Little glyphs on the eclipse dial recorded not just when an eclipse would happen, but also details like its direction, size, and color. So yes, this thing was science and superstition in one device, part astronomical calculator, part cosmic horoscope. For decades, scholars argued about what this machine really did, because most of it was just corroded fragments. Then, in the early 2000s, everything changed. A team known as the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project used advanced X-ray CT scanning and surface imaging to peer inside the fragments in microscopic detail. They discovered hidden gears that had never been seen before, plus over 2,000 characters of tiny Greek inscriptions, basically a user manual engraved on the case. Those inscriptions mention planets by name and describe the cycles used in the mechanism. One researcher described it as a textbook written on the machine itself. New reconstructions based on this data showed that the Antikythera was not a one-off crazy idea, but the highly polished end product of a long engineering tradition. This was not their first try. This was the iPhone of its day, not the prototype in the garage. Here is where the story gets even more mysterious. Based on inscriptions and calendar details, researchers think the mechanism was probably made around 100 BCE, plus or minus a few decades. The style of the calendar suggests it came from a region linked to Corinth, possibly northwest Greece, Sicily, or the island of Rhodes. Rhodes, in particular, was home to Hipparchus, one of the greatest ancient astronomers, who studied the moon's irregular motion and developed key mathematical tools later used in the mechanism's design. Some scholars suggest a connection to Archimedes, the legendary inventor from Syracuse, because ancient texts mention him building celestial devices and because Syracuse was a Corinthian colony. We do not know if Archimedes himself made it, but it almost certainly came from a school of genius-level mathematicians and engineers working in the Greek world. And remember, the mechanism was found on a Roman ship. So the Romans may have been importing Greek high-tech gadgets along with their statues. Before the Antikythera mechanism, the common story was ancient people had simple machines. Real precision gear-driven devices only show up in medieval Europe. The mechanism blew that timeline apart. We now know that by around 100 BCE, Greek engineers could cut tiny precise gears, encode complex astronomical math into mechanical form, and build devices comparable in sophistication to clocks made over 1,000 years later. One researcher wrote that the Antikythera mechanism is a beautiful conception, translated by superb engineering into a device of genius. It shows that the ancient world was not just marble statues and myth, but also high-precision engineering, lost when empires fell and knowledge scattered. Here is the question that keeps historians awake at night: was this the only one? Based on its complexity, many scholars believe the Antikythera mechanism was the product of a mature tradition, not a lone experiment. That means there could have been earlier prototypes, now lost, and more advanced models, destroyed, melted down, or still buried in other shipwrecks. So far, we have only found this one device, in 82 corroded fragments. It is like finding a single smartphone in an archaeological dig 2,000 years from now, with no other electronics around it. You would know there was an entire tech ecosystem, but you would only have one clue. The next great discovery might already be sitting in a museum storage box, mislabeled as corroded junk. The Antikythera mechanism forces us to rethink a comforting story that human progress moves in a straight, steady line from primitive to advanced. Clearly, that is not true. Over 2,000 years ago, someone built a hand-cranked mechanical universe, squeezing astronomy, mathematics, and engineering into a bronze box carried on a ship that never reached its destination. The device was lost under the sea for nearly 2,000 years, and only now are we catching up to what its creators already knew. The Antikythera mechanism does not just tell us about the sky. It tells us, about how fragile knowledge is, how easily it can be lost, and how miraculous it is when a single artifact survives long enough to remind us just how brilliant humans can be. If you enjoyed traveling back in time with this ancient computer, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Do you think there are more devices like this still waiting to be found? Thanks for watching.